Chapter 8, Part 1 of The Influence of Sea Power upon History, 1660 to 1783, by Alfred Thayer Mahan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8, 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, England's overwhelming power and conquests of the seas in North America, Europe, and East and West Indies, sea battles being off Minorca, Hawke and Conflans, Pocock and Dache in East Indies. The urgency with which peace was desired by the principal parties to the War of the Austrian Succession may perhaps be inferred from the neglect to settle definitely and conclusively many of the questions outstanding between them, and notably the very disputes about which the war between England and Spain began. It seems as though the powers feared to treat thoroughly matters that contained the germs of future quarrels, lest the discussion should prolong the war that then existed. England made peace because the fall of Holland was otherwise inevitable, not because she had enforced or surrendered her claims of 1739 against Spain. The right of uninterrupted navigation in West Indian seas, free from any search, was left undetermined, as were other kindred matters. Not only so, but the boundaries between the English and French colonies in the valley of the Ohio toward Canada and on the land side of the Nova Scotian peninsula remained as vague as they had before been. It was plain that peace could not last, and by it, if she had saved Holland, England surrendered the control of the sea which she had won. The true character of the strife, shrouded for a moment by the Continental War, was revealed by the so-called peace. Though formally allayed, the contention continued in every part of the world. In India, Dupleix, no longer able to attack the English openly, sought to undermine their power by the line of policy already described. Mingling adroitly in the quarrels of surrounding princes and advancing his own power, while so doing, he attained by rapid steps to the political control, in 1751, of the southern extremity of India, a country nearly as large as France. Given the title of Nabob, he now had a place among the princes of the land. A merely commercial policy was in his eyes a delusion. There could be no middle course between conquest and abandonment. In the course of the same year, further grants extended the French power through extensive regions to the north and east, embracing all the coast of Orissa, and made Dupleix ruler of a third of India. To celebrate his triumphs, perhaps also in accordance with his policy of impressing the native mind, he now founded a town and put up a pillar setting forth his successes. But his doings caused the directors of the company only disquietude. Instead of the reinforcements he asked for, they sent him exhortations to peace; and at about this time Robert Clive, then but 26 years old, began to show his genius. The success of Dupleix and his allies became checkered with reverses. The English under Clive's leadership supported the native opponents of the French. The company at home was but little interested in his political schemes, and was annoyed at the failure of dividends. Negotiations were opened at London for a settlement of difficulties, and Dupleix was summoned home. The English government, it is said, making his recall an absolute condition of continued peace. 2 days after his departure, in 1754, his successor signed a treaty with the English governor, wholly abandoning his policy, stipulating that neither company should interfere in the internal politics of India, and that all possessions acquired during the war in the Carnatic should be given back to the Mogul. What France thus surrendered was in extent and population an empire, and the mortification of French historians has branded the concession as ignominious. But how could the country have been held with the English navy cutting off the eagerly desired reinforcements? In North America, the declaration of peace was followed by renewed agitation, which sprang from and betokened the deep feeling and keen sense of the situation had by the colonists and local authorities on either side. The Americans held to their points with the stubbornness of their race. "There is no repose for our 13 colonies," wrote Franklin, "so long as the French are masters of Canada." The rival claims to the central unsettled region, which may accurately enough be called the valley of the Ohio, involved, if the English were successful, the military separation of Canada from Louisiana; while, on the other hand, occupation by the French, linking the two extremes of their acknowledged possessions, would shut up the English colonists between the Alleghany Mountains and the sea. The issues were apparent enough to leading Americans of that day, though they were more far-reaching than the wisest of them could have foreseen. There is room for curious speculation as to the effect, not only upon America, but upon the whole world, if the French government had had the will, and the French people the genius, effectively to settle and hold the northern and western regions which they then claimed. But while Frenchmen upon the spot saw clearly enough the coming contest, and the terrible disadvantage of unequal numbers and inferior navy under which Canada must labor, the home government was blind alike to the value of the colony and to the fact that it must be fought for; while the character and habits of the French settlers, lacking in political activity and unused to begin and carry through measures for the protection of their own interests, did not remedy the neglect of the mother country. The paternal, centralizing system of French rule had taught the colonists to look to the mother country, and then failed to take care of them. The governors of Canada of that day acted as careful and able military men, doing what they could to supply defects and weaknesses. It is possible that their action was more consistent and well planned than that of the English governors; but with the carelessness of both home governments, nothing in the end could take the place of the capacity of the English colonists to look out for themselves. It is odd and amusing to read the conflicting statements of English and French historians as to the purposes and aims of the opposing statesmen in these years when the first murmurings of the storm were heard. The simple truth seems to be that one of those conflicts familiarly known to us as irrepressible was at hand, and that both governments would gladly have avoided it. The boundaries might be undetermined; the English colonists were not. The French governors established posts where they could on the debatable ground, and it was in the course of a dispute over one of these in 1754 that the name of Washington first appears in history. Other troubles occurred in Nova Scotia, and both home governments then began to awake. In 1755, Braddock's disastrous expedition was directed against Fort Duquesne, now Pittsburgh, where Washington had surrendered the year before. Later in the year another collision between the English and French colonists happened near Lake George. Although Braddock's expedition had been first to start, the French government was also moving. In May of the same year, a large squadron of ships of war, mostly armed en flute, sailed from Brest with 3,000 troops and a new governor, de Vaudreuil, for Canada. Admiral Boscawen had already preceded this fleet, and lay in wait for it off the mouth of the St. Lawrence. There was as yet no open war, and the French were certainly within their rights in sending a garrison to their own colonies; but Boscawen's orders were to stop them. A fog which scattered the French squadron also covered its passage, but two of the ships were seen by the English fleet and captured June 8, 1755. As soon as this news reached Europe, the French ambassador to London was recalled, but still no declaration of war followed. In July, Sir Edward Hawke was sent to sea with orders to cruise between Ushant and Cape Finisterre, and to seize any French ships of the line he might see; to which were added in August further orders to take all French ships of every kind, men of war, privateers, and merchantmen, and to send them into English ports. Before the end of the year 300 trading vessels, valued at $6,000,000, had been captured, and 6,000 French seamen were imprisoned in England, enough to man nearly 10 ships of the line. All this was done while nominal peace still existed. War was not declared until 6 months later. France still seemed to submit, but she was biding her time and preparing warily a severe stroke for which she had now ample provocation. Small squadrons or detachments of ships continued to be sent to the West Indies and to Canada, while noisy preparations were made in the dockyard of Brest, and troops assembled upon the shores of the Channel. England saw herself threatened with invasion, a menace to which her people have been peculiarly susceptible. The government of the day, weak at best, was singularly unfit for waging war, and easily misled as to the real danger. Besides, England was embarrassed, as always at the beginning of a war, not only by the numerous points she had to protect in addition to her commerce, but also by the absence of a large number of her seamen in trading vessels all over the world. The Mediterranean was therefore neglected, and the French, while making loud demonstrations on the Channel, quietly equipped at Toulon 12 ships of the line, which sailed on the 10th of April, 1756, under Admiral La Galissonière, convoying 150 transports with 15,000 troops, commanded by the Duke of Richelieu. A week later the army was safely landed in Minorca and Port Mahon invested, while the fleet established itself in blockade before the harbor. Practically this was a complete surprise, for though the suspicions of the English government had been at last aroused, its action came too late. The garrison had not been reinforced, and numbered a scant 3,000 men, from which 35 officers were absent on leave, among them the governor and the colonels of all the regiments. Admiral Byng sailed from Portsmouth with 10 ships of the line only 3 days before the French left Toulon. 6 weeks later, when he reached the neighborhood of Port Mahon, his fleet had been increased to 13 ships of the line, and he had with him 4,000 troops. It was already late; a practicable breach had been made in the fortress a week before. When the English fleet came in sight, La Galissonière stood out to meet it and bar the entrance to the harbor. The battle that followed owes its historical celebrity wholly to the singular and tragic event which arose from it. Unlike Matthews's battle off Toulon, it does afford some tactical instruction, though mainly applicable to the obsolete conditions of warfare under sail. But it is especially linked to the earlier action through the effect produced upon the mind of the unfortunate Byng by the sentence of the court-martial upon Matthews. During the course of the engagement he repeatedly alluded to the censure upon that admiral for leaving the line, and seems to have accepted the judgment as justifying, if not determining, his own course. Briefly, it may be said that the two fleets, having sighted each other on the morning of the 20th of May, were found after a series of manoeuvres, both on the port tack, with an easterly wind, heading southerly, the French to leeward, between the English and the harbor. Byng ran down in line ahead off the wind, the French remaining by it, so that when the former made the signal to engage, the fleets were not parallel, but formed an angle of from 30 to 40 degrees. The attack, which Byng by his own account meant to make each ship against its opposite in the enemy's line, difficult to carry out under any circumstances, was here further impeded by the distance between the two rears being much greater than that between the vans, so that his whole line could not come into action at the same moment. When the signal was made, the van ships kept away in obedience to it, and ran down for the French, so nearly head on as to sacrifice their artillery fire in great measure. They received 3 raking broadsides, and were seriously dismantled aloft. The 6th English ship, counting from the van, had her fore-topmast shot away, flew up into the wind, and came aback, stopping and doubling up the rear of the line. Then undoubtedly was the time for Byng, having committed himself to the fight, to have set the example and borne down, just as Farragut did at Mobile when his line was confused by the stopping of the next ahead. But according to the testimony of the flag captain, Matthews's sentence deterred him. "You see, Captain Gardiner, that the signal for the line is out, and that I am ahead of the ships Louisa and Trident, which in the order should have been ahead of him. You would not have me, as the admiral of the fleet, run down as if I were going to engage a single ship. It was Mr. Matthews's misfortune to be prejudiced by not carrying down his force together, which I shall endeavor to avoid." The affair thus became entirely indecisive. The English van was separated from the rear and got the brunt of the fight. One French authority blames Galissonière for not tacking to windward of the enemy's van and crushing it. Another says he ordered the movement, but that it could not be made from the damage to the rigging; but this seems improbable, as the only injury the French squadron underwent aloft was the loss of one topsail yard, whereas the English suffered very badly. The true reason is probably that given and approved by one of the French authorities on naval warfare. Galissonière considered the support of the land attack on Mahan paramount to any destruction of the English fleet, if he thereby exposed his own. The French navy has always preferred the glory of assuring or preserving a conquest to that more brilliant perhaps, but actually less real, of taking some ships, and therein has approached more nearly the true end that has been proposed in war. The justice of this conclusion depends upon the view that is taken of the true end of naval war. If it is merely to assure one or more positions ashore, the navy becomes simply a branch of the army for a particular occasion, and subordinates its action accordingly. But if the true end is to preponderate over the enemy's navy, and so control the sea, then the enemy's ships and fleets are the true objects to be assailed on all occasions. A glimmer of this view seems to have been present to Morogues when he wrote that at sea there is no field of battle to be held, nor places to be won. If naval warfare is a war of posts, then the action of the fleets must be subordinate to the attack and defence of the posts. If its object is to break up the enemy's power on the sea, cutting off his communications with the rest of his possessions, drying up the sources of his wealth and his commerce, and making possible a closure of his ports, then the object of attack must be his organized military forces afloat; in short, his navy. It is to the latter course, for whatever reason adopted, that England owed a control of the sea that forced the restitution of Minorca at the end of this war. It is to the former that France owed the lack of prestige in her navy. Take this very case of Minorca. Had Galissonière been beaten, Richelieu and his 15,000 troops must have been lost to France, cooped up in Minorca, as the Spaniards in 1718 were confined to Sicily. The French navy therefore assured the capture of the island, but so slight was the impression on the ministry and the public that a French naval officer tells us, "Incredible as it may seem, the minister of marine, after the glorious affair off Mahon, instead of yielding to the zeal of an enlightened patriotism and profiting by the impulse which this victory gave to France to build up the navy, saw fit to sell the ships and rigging which we still had in our ports." We shall soon see the deplorable consequences of this cowardly conduct on the part of our statesmen. Neither the glory nor the victory is very apparent, but it is quite conceivable that had the French admiral thought less of Mahon and used the great advantage luck had given him to take or sink 4 or 5 of the enemy, the French people would have anticipated the outbreak of naval enthusiasm which appeared too late in 1760. During the remainder of this war, the French fleets, except in the East Indies, appear only as the pursued in a general chase. The action imposed upon the French fleets was, however, consistent with the general policy of the French government, and John Clerk was probably right in saying that there is apparent in this action off Minorca a tactics too well defined to be merely accidental, a tactics essentially defensive in its scope and aim. In assuming the lee gage, the French admiral not only covered Mahon, but took a good defensive position, imposing upon his enemy the necessity of attacking with all the consequent risks. Clerk seems to bring evidence enough to prove that the leading French ships did, after roughly handling their assailants, astutely withdraw, thus forcing the latter to attack again with like results. The same policy was repeatedly followed during the American War 20 years later, and with pretty uniform success, so much so that, although formal avowal of the policy is wanting, it may be concluded that circumspection, economy, defensive war, remained the fixed purpose of the French authorities, based doubtless upon the reasons given by Admiral Grivel of that navy. If two maritime powers are at strife, the one that has the fewest ships must always avoid doubtful engagements. It must run only those risks necessary for carrying out its missions, avoid action by manoeuvring, or at worst, if forced to engage, assure itself of favorable conditions. The attitude to be taken should depend radically upon the power of your opponent. Let us not tire of repeating, according as she has to do with an inferior or superior power, France has before her two distinct strategies, radically opposite both in means and ends: grand war and cruising war. Such a formal utterance by an officer of rank must be received with respect, and the more so when it expresses a consistent policy followed by a great and warlike nation. Yet it may be questioned whether a sea power worthy of the name can thus be secured. Logically, it follows from the position assumed that combats between equal forces are to be discouraged, because the loss to you is greater than the loss to your opponent. In fact, says Ramatuelle, upholding the French policy, of what consequence to the English would be the loss of a few ships? But the next inevitable step in the argument is that it is better not to meet the enemy. As another Frenchman previously quoted says, it was considered a mishap to their ships to fall in with a hostile force, and if one was met, their duty was to avoid action if possible, to do so honorably. They had ulterior objects of more importance than fighting the enemy's navy. Such a course cannot be consistently followed for years without affecting the spirit and tone of the officers charged with it, and it led directly to as brave a man as ever commanded a fleet, the Comte de Grasse, failing to crush the English under Rodney when he had the chance in 1782. On the 9th of April of that year, being chased by the English among the Windward Islands, it happened to him to have 16 of their fleet under his lee, while the main body was becalmed under Dominica. Though greatly superior to the separated ships during the 3 hours that this state of things lasted, De Grasse left them undisturbed, except by a distant cannonade by his own van, and his action was justified by the court which tried him, in which were many officers of high rank and doubtless of distinction, as being an act of prudence on the part of the admiral, dictated to him by the ulterior projects of the cruise. 3 days later he was signally beaten by the fleet he had failed to attack at disadvantage, and all the ulterior projects of the cruise went down with him. To return to Minorca, after the action of the 20th, Byng called a council of war, which decided that nothing more could be done, and that the English fleet should go to Gibraltar and cover that place from an attack. At Gibraltar, Byng was relieved by Hawke and sent home to be tried. The court-martial, while expressly clearing him of cowardice or disaffection, found him guilty of not doing his utmost either to defeat the French fleet or to relieve the garrison at Mahan; and as the article of war prescribed death with no alternative punishment for this offence, it felt compelled to sentence him to death. The king refused to pardon, and Byng was accordingly shot. The expedition against Minorca was begun while nominal peace still lasted. On the 17th of May, 3 days before Byng's battle, England declared war, and France replied on the 20th of June. On the 28th, Port Mahon surrendered, and Minorca passed into the hands of France. The nature of the troubles between the two nations and the scenes where they occurred pointed out clearly enough the proper theatre of the strife, and we should by rights now be at the opening of a sea war, illustrated by great naval actions and attended with great modifications in the colonial and foreign possessions of the two powers. Of the two, England alone recognized the truth. France was again turned aside from the sea by causes which will shortly be given. Her fleets scarcely appeared, and losing the control of the sea, she surrendered one by one her colonies and all her hopes in India. Later in the struggle she drew in Spain as her ally, but it was only to involve that country in her own external ruin. England, on the other hand, defended and nourished by the sea, rode it everywhere in triumph. Secure and prosperous at home, she supported with her money the enemies of France. At the end of 7 years, the kingdom of Great Britain had become the British Empire. It is far from certain that France could have successfully contended with England on the sea without an ally. In 1756 the French navy had 63 ships of the line, of which 45 were in fair condition, but equipments and artillery were deficient. Spain had 46 ships of the line, but from the previous and subsequent performances of the Spanish navy, it may well be doubted if its worth were equal to its numbers. England at this time had 130 ships of the line. 4 years later she had 120 actually in commission. Of course, when a nation allows its inferiority, whether on land or sea, to become as great as that of France now was, it cannot hope for success. Nevertheless, she obtained advantages at first. The conquest of Minorca was followed in November of the same year by the acquisition of Corsica. The Republic of Genoa surrendered to France all the fortified harbors of the island. With Toulon, Corsica, and Port Mahon, she now had a strong grip on the Mediterranean. In Canada, the operations of 1756 under Montcalm were successful despite the inferiority of numbers. At the same time, an attack by a native prince in India took from the English Calcutta and gave an opportunity to the French. Yet another incident offered a handle for French statesmanship to strengthen her position on the ocean. The Dutch had promised France not to renew their alliance with England, but to remain neutral. England retaliated by declaring all the ports of France in a state of blockade, and all vessels bound to those ports liable to seizure as lawful prize. Such a violation of the rights of neutrals can only be undertaken by a nation that feels it has nothing to fear from their rising against it. The aggressiveness, born of the sense of power which characterized England, might have been used by France to draw Spain and possibly other states into alliance against her. Instead of concentrating against England, France began another continental war, this time with a new and extraordinary alliance. The Empress of Austria, working on the religious superstitions of the king and upon the anger of the king's mistress, who was piqued at sarcasms uttered against her by Frederick the Great, drew France into an alliance with Austria against Prussia. This alliance was further joined by Russia, Sweden, and Poland. The Empress urged that the two Roman Catholic powers should unite to take Silesia away from a Protestant king, and expressed her willingness to give to France a part of her possessions in the Netherlands, which France had always desired. Frederick the Great, learning the combination against him, instead of waiting for it to develop, put his armies in motion and invaded Saxony, whose ruler was also King of Poland. This movement in October 1756 began the 7 Years' War, which, like the War of the Austrian Succession, but not to the same extent, drew some of the contestants off from the original cause of difference. But while France, having already on hand one large quarrel with her neighbor across the Channel, was thus needlessly entering upon another struggle, with the avowed end of building up that Austrian Empire which a wiser policy had long striven to humble, England this time saw clearly where her true interest lay. Making the continental war wholly subsidiary, she turned her efforts upon the sea and the colonies, at the same time supporting Frederick both with money and cordial sympathy in the war for the defence of his kingdom, which so seriously diverted and divided the efforts of France. England thus had really but one war on hand. In the same year the direction of the struggle was taken from the hands of a weak ministry and given into those of the bold and ardent William Pitt, who retained his office till 1761, by which time the ends of the war had practically been secured. In the attack upon Canada there were two principal lines to be chosen, that by the way of Lake Champlain and that by the way of the St. Lawrence. The former was entirely inland, and as such does not concern our subject, beyond noting that not till after the fall of Quebec in 1759 was it fairly opened to the English. In 1757 the attempt against Louisburg failed. The English admiral being unwilling to engage 16 ships of the line he found there, with the 15 under his own command, which were also, he said, of inferior metal. Whether he was right in his decision or not, the indignation felt in England clearly shows the difference of policy underlying the action of the French and English governments. The following year an admiral of a higher spirit, Boscawen, was sent out accompanied with 12,000 troops, and it must in fairness be said, found only 5 ships in the port. The troops were landed while the fleet covered the siege from the only molestation it could fear, and cut off from the besieged the only line by which they could look for supplies. The island fell in 1758, opening the way by the St. Lawrence to the heart of Canada, and giving the English a new base both for the fleet and army. The next year the expedition under Wolfe was sent against Quebec. All his operations were based upon the fleet, which not only carried his army to the spot, but moved up and down the river as the various feints required. The landing which led to the decisive action was made directly from the ships. Montcalm, whose skill and determination had blocked the attacks by way of Lake Champlain the 2 previous years, had written urgently for reinforcements, but they were refused by the Minister of War, who replied that in addition to other reasons it was too probable that the English would intercept them on the way, and that the more France sent, the more England would be moved to send. In a word, the possession of Canada depended upon sea power. Montcalm, therefore, in view of the certain attack upon Quebec by the river, was compelled to weaken his resistance on the Champlain route. Nevertheless, the English did not get farther than the foot of the lake that year, and their operations, though creditable, had no effect upon the result at Quebec. In 1760, the English, holding the course of the St. Lawrence, with Louisburg at one end and Quebec at the other, seemed firmly seated. Nevertheless, the French governor, de Vaudreuil, still held out at Montreal, and the colonists still hoped for help from France. The English garrison at Quebec, though inferior in numbers to the forces of the Canadians, was imprudent enough to leave the city and meet them in the open field. Defeated there and pursued by the enemy, the latter nearly entered Quebec pell-mell with the English troops, and trenches were opened against the city. A few days later an English squadron came in sight, and the place was relieved. Thus, says the old English chronicler of the navy, the enemy saw what it was to be inferior at sea, for had a French squadron got the start of the English in sailing up the river, Quebec must have fallen. Wholly cut off now, the little body of Frenchmen that remained in Montreal was surrounded by three English armies, which had come, one by way of Lake Champlain, the others from Oswego and from Quebec. The surrender of the city on the 8th of September, 1760, put an end forever to the French possession of Canada. In all other quarters of the world, after the accession of Pitt to power, the same good fortune followed the English arms, checkered only at the first by some slight reverses. It was not so on the continent, where the heroism and skill of Frederick the Great maintained with difficulty his brilliant struggle against France, Austria, and Russia. The study of the difficulties of his position, of the military and political combinations attending it, do not belong to our subject. Sea power does not appear directly in its effects upon the struggle, but indirectly it was felt in two ways. First, by the subsidies which the abundant wealth and credit of England enabled her to give Frederick, in whose thrifty and able hands they went far; and second, in the embarrassment caused to France by the attacks of England upon her colonies and her own sea coast, in the destruction of her commerce, and in the money, all too little, it is true, and grudgingly given, which France was forced to bestow on her navy. Stung by the constant lashing of the power of the sea, France, despite the blindness and unwillingness of the rulers, was driven to undertake something against it. With a navy much inferior, unable to cope in all quarters of the world, it was rightly decided to concentrate upon one object, and the object chosen was Great Britain itself, whose shores were to be invaded. This decision, soon apprehended by the fears of the English nation, caused the great naval operations to centre for some years around the coast of France and in the Channel. Before describing them, it will be well to sum up the general plan by which England was guided in the use of her overwhelming sea power. Besides the operations on the North American continent already described, this plan was fourfold. 1. The French Atlantic ports were watched in force, especially Brest, so as to keep the great fleets or small squadrons from getting out without fighting. 2. Attacks were made upon the Atlantic and Channel coasts with flying squadrons, followed at times by the descent of small bodies of troops. These attacks, the direction of which could not be foreseen by the enemy, were chiefly intended to compel him to keep on hand forces at many points, and so to diminish the army acting against the King of Prussia. While the tendency would certainly be that way, it may be doubted whether the actual diversion in favor of Frederick was of much consequence. No particular mention will be made of these operations, which had but little visible effect upon the general course of the war. 3. A fleet was kept in the Mediterranean and near Gibraltar to prevent the French Toulon fleet from getting round to the Atlantic. It does not appear that any attempt was seriously made to stop communications between France and Minorca. The action of the Mediterranean fleet, though an independent command, was subsidiary to that in the Atlantic. 4. Distant foreign expeditions were sent against the French colonies in the West India Islands and on the coast of Africa, and a squadron was maintained in the East Indies to secure the control of those seas, thereby supporting the English in the peninsula, and cutting off the communications of the French. These operations in distant waters, never intermitted, assumed greater activity and larger proportions after the destruction of the French navy had relieved England from the fear of invasion, and when the ill-advised entrance of Spain into the war in 1762 offered yet richer prizes to her enterprise. End of Chapter 8, Part 1.